My name is Mats Horsmar. I'm Deputy Managing Director at the Expert Group for Aid Studies, EBA, which is a committee under the Minister for Foreign Affairs here in Sweden. We evaluate and analyze Swedish international development cooperation, but we also contribute to knowledge and learning as a basis for decision-making and practice. That's in our remit. So we co-organized this seminar with SIDA's humanitarian unit. And we have the honor to have with us representatives from ALNAP, the International Learning Network for Humanitarian Work. ALNAP has in Sweden 3 members, SIDA, the Red Cross and Médecins Sans Frontières. ALNAP has been around for 25 years, and this is an occasion then to reflect on learning in humanitarian work. We would have had Johan Schar as moderator to this seminar. Johan Schar is Deputy Chair of EBA and Chair of the ALNAP network. He sends his apologies, he couldn't be here, but instead I'm very happy to hand over to Lisa Hedin from the SIDA Humanitarian Unit, who will lead us through this seminar. Lisa, over to you.
Thank you so much, Mats. And again, apologies for the delay in starting this interesting conversation on learning in humanitarian work. And we are delighted to shed some light on this because we believe it's really key. ALNAP is extremely well placed. That's your role within the humanitarian sector, to ensure that we evaluate and we learn. And you're also a long-time partner of SIDA's, and we appreciate our partnership very much and how you push us towards looking more into learning. And at SIDA, we, in line with our strategy that we are currently integrating, one of our key goals is increased capacity and effectiveness and efficiency of the humanitarian system. And this, of course, requires learning and change. And I also believe that it's also extremely timely to talk about this right now, given what grim outlook we have in terms of what the world looks like in terms of humanitarian needs. And that we have a system that works, but that needs to work even better in order to respond to needs. So I think it's really key also to focus on this, how to learn and how to change and how to make the humanitarian response and the humanitarian system more effective and efficient and principled. So we are delighted, to be joined then by John Mitchell. You led ALNAP network for almost 15 years, and before that you have experience working for the UN and for donors, and you have had particular focus also on accountability in aid. And we have Juliet Parker. You are acting director another 2 weeks, right? Then you will be the director at ALNAP. You have 20 years experience of humanitarian programming, and with particular focus on monitoring, evaluation, accountability and learning. And then, so we will listen. It's quite an easy setup for this conversation. We will start with listening to Juliet and John. But then, I'm also extremely happy that we have 3 panelists that will share their reflections on the presentation. And we have Per Örneus, you're today's special envoy to the Syria crisis at the Swedish MFA, but you have extensive humanitarian experience in various positions, inter alia being the chief negotiator on World Humanitarian Summit 2017. We have Erik Lysén. You are director at the International Affairs with ACT Church of Sweden, and you've been involved since 1991 on issues related to humanitarian affairs, human rights and social justice. And you're also the chair of the ACT Alliance globally. And we have Linda Öhman, who's the head of MSF Evaluation Unit. You have experience from humanitarian aid, human rights and peace building from Palestine and Syria, among many other contexts. So, a warm welcome to all the 5 of you. And my role is actually quite easy as a moderator, because I will look forward to listening in to all your interesting observations on this key subject. But without further ado, I then hand over to you for the presentation. But before I forget, I also wanted to mention that we will allow time for some questions and comments also for all of you who participate digitally. So prepare your comments. I'm looking at Emma now in the chat, right? In the chat. So Emma here will moderate the comments and questions. So we will allow time also for questions from the room and also from the chat. But with that, I hand over to John and Juliet.
Lisa, that's great. Could I just check that the presentation is with us before we start? No. There we go. Excellent. Very good. Lisa, thank you very much, and good afternoon to all of you, including our Zoom participants. I hope you can see me and hear me clearly. So today I'd like to address some very long-standing issues about learning, change and improvements in the humanitarian system. Now, there's a lot of evidence to show that learning has taken place in huge quantities since ALNAP was first set up 25 years ago. And the ALNAP Help Library, for example, now holds over 20,000 learning resources, including all manner of evaluations, research and other learning documents. But the question is, what does it all add up to? Why does some of it seem to stick and bring about changes and improvements, whilst other learning gathers dust on shelves or simply fades away, never to be seen again? So as part of ALNAP's 25-year anniversary, we wanted to understand the big picture and discover how learning leads to change and improvements, to what actually works and why. So before I get on to that, let's recap on what we know or what we have learned so far. Well, we know from the ALNAP State of the Humanitarian System report that there have been some very bright spots over time and improvements have happened. Every year, the system saves many thousands of lives in extremis, and the evidence suggests that we're getting better at doing this. Incremental improvements have happened, including flexible funding, more effective aid, the use of better cash, better interagency coordination through the clusters, and other innovations. However, on the downside, we've also seen a serious decline in access, security, and adherence to humanitarian principles. And several other key areas of performance seem firmly stuck, with little or no improvement over the years, including accountability to aid recipients and real change towards more locally led aid. So changes where they have happened mainly in the technical areas, water and sanitation, health, logistics, and so on. But changing the system itself and the way that the system operates has eluded us. And I think this was brought home to us particularly after the COVID-19 pandemic, which created extraordinary constraints, but also considerable opportunities for learning and change. And for many, the hope was that the vacuum generated by the lack of mobility of international staff might encourage localization in the global response of COVID, truly making aid as local as possible and as international as necessary. And during the response, we did see some positive signs. Parts of the international system were able to adapt, and many creative local initiatives emerged. But it was also the case that these efforts were seen to be disparate and not well aligned, and as such would probably not be long-lasting or sustained beyond the pandemic response. And I think the fact is that the international architecture and business model remains static. Donors are still the same, with the usual international agencies, mainly the UN and the Red Cross Red Crescent movement, receiving the lion's share of the funding, while local agencies miss out. And this continues to be played out today in Ukraine, where we see Ukraine being incredibly well funded for international agencies, but only a tiny proportion of that money has gone to local agencies. So in summary then, we can say that the international system is relatively stable, it's functioning quite well in its own terms, and it's making slow incremental improvements, mainly in technical areas. And this shows that our system is not monolithic or static, but it is clearly resistant to deeper change and transformative improvements. And one could say that it's kind of stuck in a kind of functioning inertia. So faced with these realities, we wanted to understand what role learning has played in all of this, both the successes and the failures, and how best to use learning as a lever to bring about more radical changes and improvements. So we start with the definition of learning, which is the process of positive change in individual and collective thinking and action, and a means by which these processes are linked to and become embedded within the systems and strategies of organizations and wider sections in which they operate. Note here that learning works at the level of the individual, the organization, including teams and networks, and the system. And within this definition, it's useful to differentiate between 3 different types of learning, which you can see in the diagram, and I'll run you through these. If we read the diagram from right to left, we can see that single loop learning asks the question, are we doing the right thing? And this kind of learning is undertaken in line with explicit practices, policies, and norms of behavior. Learning here involves detecting and correcting deviations from these norms, but does not challenge the assumptions or values that give rise to the actions themselves. So here, the intentions of the organization are not questioned, and learning is entirely about how to achieve these intentions better. And the second one, double loop learning, asks the question, are we doing the right thing? And this involves deeper reflection on underlying practices, policies and norms, and it addresses the basic aspects of an organization and tries to make them more flexible in response to changing contexts. It usually involves questioning underlying assumptions, beliefs and values, which can be reformed and refined as a result of that learning. And the third is triple loop learning, which asks the question, are we doing the right thing for the right reasons? And this represents the highest form of organizational self-examination. And it involves questioning the entire rationale of an organization. And this can, if it's done well, lead to radical transformations in internal structures, cultures, and practices. However, the thing is, what we have found is that most humanitarian learning has been at the level of single loop learning, often technical advances in specific sectors. A little bit has been at the double loop learning, such as efforts to improve adaptable response or cache responses, but very, very little has been at the level of triple loop learning. So we know from the literature that other sectors have had significant challenges with learning too, especially the double loop and the triple loop. And these perceptions are still with us today. We've spoken to a lot of humanitarian managers that tell us this. And there are a number of reasons for this. So at an individual level, humanitarians today have far more knowledge and experience than in days gone by. There's a clear sense that while individual learning processes have been established, these have not been extrapolated upwards to better group organizational or system-wide learning. On the process side, there's been a concerted effort to bureaucratize knowledge and sharing and learning so that they happen in predictable ways at predefined points within established processes throughout the program cycle. But the bureaucratization of learning processes has happened in ways that can make them rather dull, a little bit routine, predictable, and even possibly tokenistic. And on the cultural side, in general, humanitarian organizations place much greater emphasis on action than reflection. And as a result, learning cultures tend to play second fiddle to core operations. So where learning has happened, it's tended to reinforce and support the status quo within the organization, again, reflecting this tendency for single loop learning. So, in summary, most of the work on humanitarian learning over the past few decades has focused on the left-hand side of this spectrum, on individual and process levels. And as a result, we've seen more training courses and technical standards as well as many evaluative tools. And this has helped definitely bring about the incremental improvements that I mentioned earlier. But the right-hand emphasis has overshadowed the cultural and organizational dimensions that might lead to the more transformational changes that many people have called for and many people expect. So, having drawn these rather sobering conclusions, we wanted to understand why learning brought about some changes in improvement and while other learning didn't. So, up to now, we've only been able to see bits and pieces of the overall picture. and we've not been sure if or how these different parts relate to one another. And it felt a bit like the old Arabic proverb about 10 blind men feeling different parts of the elephant. The tail may feel like a big snake, the flank like a wall, or the tail like a piece of rope. Until all these dimensions are visible, it's very easy to become confused and make inaccurate consumptions. So in order to get a complete picture, we've borrowed a model from a very eminent scholar on systems, innovation and change, a man called Frank Giles of Manchester University. Now, Giles developed a multi-level perspective for understanding the way that learning brings about change. And it's a kind of theory of change for how the system and the sector actually learns and adapts. And the key thing to remember here is that changes and improvements come about from various kinds of interactions at 3 different levels in the system. So we've applied this model to some prominent issues within our own world, including cash-based responses. And I'm going to say more about this in a minute, but let me first explain the general model itself. So, niches, that's there at the bottom left-hand corner, is where new learning practices happen. Now here, these niche ideas are often driven by mavericks or research entrepreneurs. They build momentum through learning processes and support from grassroots networks. And these spaces serve as incubation rooms away from the normal dynamics of the sector. And eventually, they coalesce with engagement from frontline workers and interest groups, and allow time and space for research and learning through experience. That's all happening in these niches. Regimes, which is halfway up the vertical axis, as we know, in the humanitarian sector, these regimes consist of OECD donors, of which you are one, of course, UN agencies, the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, and international NGOs, all of which make up the institutional architecture. And inherent within this regime are established sets of practices, processes, skills, technologies, organizational cultures, and associated rules and values, all of which are deeply embedded. Oh, I got carried away there, and there we go. All of which are, now I've lost my place here now. Just bear with me. All of which are deeply embedded in mindsets and of course power structures within the organization. There we go, got it right. And landscapes are at the top of the axis, and these are the wider contexts of a given industry or sector. And these are the macro factors that shape the sector and the interaction of actors within it. And for humanitarians, these are both particular crises and also the wider socio-economic and political contexts that shape how crises play out. So we could take Ukraine again, for example. Here we have a disconnect at the level of UN Security Council, who are unable to ensure safe humanitarian conditions for displaced people and families. So that's the model. And with this model in mind now, I want to tell you the story, or at least my story, of how cash-based programming became so successful. Now, I've chosen this partly because I was involved in the early stages of this in the 1990s. So let's start at point 1, which is at the niche level. So I'm talking about cash-based programming here. The fundamental point here is that the humanitarian sector at that time had resisted using cash for many years, and much of the learning that had taken place had reinforced a commonly held belief that poor people couldn't be trusted with money. Now, these existing attitudes were very entrenched at the time, and power dynamics remained unchallenged. So hold that thought, because I'll come back to that. And we can see from point 2 that under the radar, small-scale experiments were taking place at the same time. And the first one that I saw was in UNICEF in Ethiopia as far back as 1985. And we saw many more in the 1990s, particularly with the ICRC, and also some developmental NGOs who were beginning to become involved in emergencies and were also trialling the idea. And I was aware of this at the time as I worked for the Red Cross. and we decided to do some research to capture these experiences, which is point 3 here. And again, we found that lack of trust in poorer people or vulnerable communities was identified as the main barrier for not taking up cash. And the report that we produced, which was called Buying Power, helped give legitimacy and voice to the idea itself, which was beginning to be shown as both feasible and practical. And so more niche learning happened soon afterwards, thanks to the policy of the research community, especially ODI's Humanitarian Policy Group, which is point 4 there. And as a result, this body of knowledge began to build and the atmosphere began to change. Then in 2005, something very important happened on the landscape level. The Indian Ocean tsunami happened. So that's point 5. Then the landscape, as you know, changed dramatically, creating very favourable conditions for experimentation with cash transfers. And this learning within organisations enabled breakthrough learning to happen so that cash became mainstream in the tsunami response. And the myth that affected populations were not responsible enough to make their own final financial decisions was eventually dispelled. And in addition, the momentum created after the tsunami response created more favourable conditions for the use of cash after the big earthquakes in Pakistan and in Haiti, and many other responses besides. So new learning then was becoming reinforced, not like the negative learning before, and this time the reinforcement was positive. So on a personal level, this framework has really helped me see the whole cash elephant, so to speak. And you know, I should tell you that we have also applied this model to other issues, important issues: localization, the use of mobile phones, and participation, all of which tell very, very different stories. I haven't time to go into them now, but looking at them all together, standing back, which we did, and tried to see what was going on, we can see that where changes and improvements do happen, they follow recognizable stages, which are as follows. Say a quick prayer that this works. It works. Wonderful. So, stage 1. We can see that these changes at the landscape level create pressures on existing regimes to create opportunities of learning, like the tsunami that I just mentioned. So, the landscape changes, new opportunities arrive. When these happen, alongside these, the niche ideas and innovations have to be bubbling away, as they were during the 1990s when visionary operators were experimenting with cash. And stage 3, and this is the important bit, is the positive alignment of these processes enables the breakthrough of learning around novel practices into the mainstream system. And stage 4, once they're in the mainstream system, they become tested and developed. For example, the way that World Food Programme changed from being a food delivery agency to a food assistance agency. And so over time, these become part of stage 5, the reformed regime, and they have a big influence on the landscape. And so you can see that these stages show how learning affects improvement as a result of crisis or landscape changes. You can see how the behaviours of social actors during these change processes are very important, and you can see that the dynamics of learning that take place contribute to that change. So earlier I said that we tested these other issues with the model, and they had very different outcomes to the success that we had with cash. But I'd like to leave you with one of our key findings, which is this: that even though learning doesn't always lead to change, all of the bright spots I referred to earlier were underpinned by learning. And this has big implications for the way we understand, fund and implement learning in the future. And so I want to leave you with 5 key messages. I think they're going to come. They're not going to come up for me. Can I wait? Let's see if they work. Do you know what? It doesn't really matter. Just listen to what I'm saying.
We'll listen to you carefully.
Yeah, it's not that important. Key message 1. So ultimately, better learning has been seen as vital for delivering better humanitarian results, that's for sure. And conscious and deliberate learning does play an important role in the humanitarian sector. Key message 2 is that learning is not linear and simply simple. It is about the interaction of political, institutional, and crisis contexts. All of these add up to having a powerful influence. And key message 3 is that learning helps crisis responders demonstrate feasibility. That's a really important thing. It hasn't happened with localization. We don't know that it's feasible yet. So it helps demonstrate feasibility. It makes comparisons. It frames the problems and opportunities so that operations can adapt. Key message 4 is that alongside all the successes, learning is almost, and this is true, I'm afraid, rather a painful, contested and challenging process, sometimes best described as a learning struggle. And key message 5 is that we need to be aware that while these crises create significant windows of opportunity, that doesn't mean that we should just wait for crisis to hit to instigate effective learning. Peacetime preparation is very important. And my very, very final closing point is this. Now, given that we seem to be living in and working in a world of permanent crisis, I think we do need to take the bigger picture view of learning. And I've described here how we understand how the totality of how learning contributes to change. It's not a totalitarian totality, it's just a neutral totality. So if we don't, we risk remaining compartmentalized and siloed, and ultimately we will make less of a difference to the communities that we seek to serve. And this is the important thing. This requires, though, a shift of mindset. At the moment, I think it's fair to say that we humanitarians still have a culture that places action over reflection. And that fast action is somehow more appropriate, and we think it's more an appropriate way for fulfilling humanitarian principles. But our experience doing this work is actually that's not really the case. And if there's one thing I want you to take away from today is that I think that systemic analysis, reflection, and considered analysis should be at the very heart of 21st century humanitarianism. So thanks for listening. Sorry for the glitches along the way, and looking forward to hearing your reactions.
Thank you so much, John, for a very, I think, inspiring, rich, and also challenging presentation that challenges us. And I would like to start then to ask Per for your reactions, reflections on the presentation that we just heard. So over to you, Per.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I've spent a considerable part of my professional life in the field of humanitarian diplomacy or policy or politics or bureaucracy, if you like. I've never been a field worker, but I've certainly visited a great number of field operations. My field operations has been rather Geneva, New York, Brussels. So having said that, my entry point here today is more from a sort of global systems perspective than from the perspective of active organizational learning, which is not my area of expertise. Nevertheless, I actually believe that I have some input to this discussion, and I might even have a slightly provocative message to you or to us. So, as also Lisa said, my last major engagement in the humanitarian enterprise was as Sherpa or key negotiator to the process of a high-level panel of humanitarian finance that was our then Minister of Foreign Affairs, Margot Wallström, was in this panel, and it was commissioned by Ban Ki-moon, and it was sort of a year of work running up to the so-called Humanitarian World Summit that was held in 2016 in May or so. And for those of you who have forgotten or maybe never heard of this, I can quote what this World Humanitarian Summit was by just reading from the web page. It says the summit's goal was to fundamentally reform the humanitarian aid industry to react more effectively to today's many crises. World leaders were expected to come to the summit and announce the actions they would take to end the suffering of millions, etc. unfortunately, I've not been in a position to actually witness any major improvements or reforms to the humanitarian system. Rather the opposite. And this is the last 6 years. And as John showed the slide here, where are we today? The question arises, where are we today? And as you summarized in 4 points that in this PowerPoint slide, 4 important aspects here. The system is characterized by unchanging international architecture. Nothing changes. Decline in access and adherence to humanitarian principles, a very dangerous thing. No improvements in accountability to affected communities. Listen to that. And finally, the system stuck in a kind of functioning inertia, as you see, sort of passivity or cramps or sort of immobility. This, I must say, is a rather sad description of reality. But I believe that most of us, at least those of us who claim to be a bit honest, can subscribe to this description. So, well, then back to this high-level panel that I was part of. From the outset, the definition in this panel, the definition of the problem was a general lack of funding to the system, as if the only challenge here was lack of financial resources. Of course, lack of financial resources continues to be a great problem, but not the only problem. In the discussion, we kept sort of meeting very frequently. A group of us started to find a way of describing the humanitarian enterprise, or as it says in their own webpage, aid industry. We started to regard the humanitarian system as what we called a humanitarian ecosystem. We found it to be a constructive way of describing the entirety of the system and its dependencies, interdependencies. Governments, regional organizations, multilateral organizations and institutions, international NGOs, civil society in a broad sense, including SMEs and academia, local NGOs, and not least, affected populations. Put in simple words, we saw a complete ecosystem with hierarchies, functions, and dysfunctionalities, a very intricate and sensitive system. We saw a system that was dominated by huge actors, state actors and huge multilaterals, in a way on top of a pyramid, if you like. And we saw a system that was characterized by lack of trust, lack of inclusion of affected communities and local actors. And in the bottom of this pyramid, we saw the affected populations, often not at all included in any discussion. We also saw local NGOs, those who provide the services in the field, reaching far and deep and taking most of the risks. These key actors most often treated without due respect or inclusion in any discussion on response. This appeared to us as a complex and sensitive system in great need of change and nourishment. So after months of discussion, we came to some questions, like what if one could turn this pyramid upside down, or maybe at least tilt it a little bit? What if one could incentivize the great dominating actors, state actors and the huge multilaterals, the UN system basically, to seriously include and emancipate the affected populations and the local NGOs in planning and implementation? And what if one could start to regard local actors and NGOs as highly valuable partners. Partners rather than regarding them as subcontractors. Great difference there, right? And what about investing, seriously investing in partnership, inclusion and trust? What about the big players delegate some of their power? We spent half a year discussing this, and the outcome is known to us all. As we heard, what we were talking about, I don't know, unchanging international architecture, decline in access, no improvements in accountability. Well, basically, to my view, nothing really happened. A system stuck in functioning inertia. So, finally, in closing, why on earth am I telling this story? What's my point here? Well, my comment and my contribution here today is possibly a suggestion or maybe a credo. I think and I hope and I believe that actors in the humanitarian field, in the humanitarian enterprise, the system, the ecosystem, should start suggesting and demanding change. Those who urge, those who demand, those who feel it's necessary to see change should really put pressure, serious pressure, on politicians, state actors, decision makers in the big international family, the whatever it is, the UN, the World Bank, ECHO, whoever. One should put pressure on all these dominating multilaterals, pressure to shift, tilt this pyramid. And I do believe that it is of utmost importance that one verbalizes this, because change, I believe, and this sounds almost religious or political at least, change comes from within. It comes from within a system, and many times change must come from beneath, from below. Delegation of power for those in power is often very scary, so there must be a strong pressure from beneath. So maybe it could be time for a humanitarian Greta Thunberg to step up and demand changes and improvements in this humanitarian ecosystem, because it can't function the way it does today. It's just not efficient, it's not human. It is time to change. So let's try to aim for establishing a well-functioning, sustainable humanitarian ecosystem built on trust, inclusion, and true partnership. Thanks for listening.
Thanks so much, Per, for that credo demanding change, and change comes from within and from below. A lot of things to think about. And I think it's quite a nice bridge to hand over to you, Erik, because I know ACT and Church of Sweden and your partners on the ground localization is dear to your heart and you work on it. So when you've heard what John presented, and also please react to Per's observations if you would like to. What is your comments, observations, messages?
Well, thank you so much, John, for your presentation. I think it resonates well with Church of Sweden and also with my colleagues in the ACT Alliance. It's, I think, important to note, in light of sort of the challenges that you pose to us as well, Per, that the ACT Alliance consists of members in more than 140 members in 120 countries. So these issues of trust and power at the systemic level also comes into the alliance itself. So when you have 70% of the members are from the global south and only 30% are from the global north in Western Europe and North America, of course these issues about localization, about trusting us in your partnerships become crucial. And I think honestly, I'm reflecting on your report, whether we are in the single or the double or the triple loop learning, that I think we are perhaps in the double loop learning as the ACT Alliance, because we are pushing hard now for localization. And with localization we mean sort of locally led community initiatives, locally led citizen action for humanitarian response. And that is now pushed by a number of ACT members, including ACT Charter Sweden, including also some of the Western European members. But I also recognize that in a big alliance, you have the tensions, and you're saying this is a contested terrain, so you have sort of different views of whether that will work or not. So you always have organizational barriers among certain members, and then you have other members that are pushing for this. But I think it's really time, as you referred to the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016, and you talked about, John, unchanged international architecture. I still want to believe that in terms of the niche ideas or the niche networks are around certain ideas like cash programming, that we are, in the case of the Ukraine response, that we are taking some steps towards localization. It's true, as you say, that still, if we look at the funding, it's piecemeal for the local responders. But at least within the ACT Alliance, we have a concerted effort. We have a big ACT appeal. And as chairperson, we have had, of this, on the governing board of the ACT Alliance, we have had crucial discussions about not having the European ACT members enter into Ukraine with large-scale humanitarian programs, because work through the national and regional organizations that you already have present. Instead, work with capacity sharing initiatives on cash programming, psychosocial support, protection issues, gender issues, and also on the SELR methodology that I talked about, survive and community-led responses and initiative. And that is happening actually. These large international ACT members from you are taking a step back and is working together with the national and the local organizations, and also trying to set up sort of these different initiatives in getting communities on board. That is just a small picture of the whole picture, but still it's happening, and it's happening in the ACT family. But having said that, we still have the tensions also with the ACT Alliance. We still have some dominant voices saying, no, that cannot be scaled up. It's not possible, and you have to think about the complex compliance requirements that we have from back donors. We cannot put the trust in the local communities. We cannot put the funds there, because linked to this model with the SLR methodology is that you're working on group cash grants and community cash grants. And they come together in communities, they define their own priorities, and with that comes funding from the local or the national organizations. And before that, we've had training with the international organization, and then we take a step back. So this is between the national organizations and the communities and the self-help groups. And then they get funding. They prioritize what needs to happen now in this response, and they get funding for that. And then it becomes automatically Nexus. By itself, when they sort of list their priorities. Some of it is, of course, urgent sort of food response, non-food items, medicines, but others is also repairing the infrastructure and so forth. And that's exactly what we see now in the Ukraine case. So I think in terms of learning, it will be crucial to see how we will evaluate these efforts in the Ukraine response. Also, not only for the ACT family, but broadly speaking in the sector.
Thank you so much, Erik. And Linda, I mean, you're head of evaluation at MSF, and also know you've been reflecting a lot on localization in your previous positions. But I mean, what are you don't need to focus on localization necessarily, but your immediate reactions to what you've heard on change and learning. Curious to hear. So over to you, Linda.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for the presentation and for your comments. I think it's interesting to sit here in what I kind of feel like maybe like one of the smallest cogs in the wheel of this big structure, you know. So it's like a very specific task that we have. We're the evaluation unit. It's it's very specific in this big picture, basically. And I also reflected on this about single or double loop or triple loop learning, and relating it then back to what we do in our unit. And I guess I'll share with you like the reflections of what we do in the unit and what I think is like a bit different. And then I have some thoughts about why is it that's different for us in our situation. And I think so the two things that I thought about is the being stuck in a way and doing things the same. And as an evaluation unit, like in most international NGOs and the ones I've worked for, an evaluation unit or a monitoring and evaluation unit, or then a monitoring, evaluation, accountability and learning unit, or however you want to call them. I mean, a large part of the task is to deliver reporting for externals, no? And I would say the biggest difference in our unit is that we are absolutely delivering externally to the world, because transparency is incredibly important, and our evaluation reports are published externally, pretty much all of them. But I mean, we actually evaluate for ourselves. We evaluate to be accountable to ourselves in what we do, and we choose what we evaluate, which means that we can evaluate anything from a very specific component in a project to a bigger response, like evaluating the Ebola response in Congo over a matter of 3 years. So I think with that possibility and with that ability, we're able to do things different, and we're able to look at that. And then we've been able to move ourselves towards, I would say, this double loop learning by being able to think also conceptually. And it's pretty luxurious to be in a space to be able to do that, to have both the time and the resources to engage in more institutional learning, more conceptual learning. And we've done it in a couple of ways. We've done it by looking across our evaluations over several years and saying, okay, what do they say back to the organization? So both what do we identify as recurring issues that the organization needs to think about, but also the other way around, what kind of questions do we have? So we've got questions about where MSF is when it comes to community engagement. What answers can we find in the evaluations over the year? And honestly, I don't see that same possibility for many other M&E units and other organizations. That's just not what you have time to work on. So we're in the middle of our strategic process, and we're thinking about all these things. And we know we work for quality, we work for learning, we work for accountability. But maybe we need to work in there also, how we work for change in reality, because of course all these things are to drive towards change and to make things better. And I consider myself to be in a very fortunate position to be in a place where that possibility, I think, exists. Because I know that I've been in other organizations where that cog feeling is perhaps even more solid, and you don't necessarily think that you have the time and the space to engage in that kind of reflection and bring it back to your organization.
Thank you. Very interesting, and it seems a bit luxurious, and to value it, to be accountable for what we do. I think that's encouraging to hear from you. I think now we are at that point in time where we should have a look at what has happened on the chat in Zoom, right? So I look at Mats and Emma.
Since I got the microphone, I can read it, and I'll stand here so visible. There's one question from Julle Bergenholz Foglander to the panel. Within the humanitarian, there was a hope that the challenges created by the COVID-19 pandemic would be the catalyst for localization that the sector had waited for. This did not, however, not happen. It has been the same thing with the Ukraine crisis. With this in mind, do you think that there is a type of crisis or event or protest that can actually make serious progress on localization happen? If so, what would that be?
Should we start with that? Is that the only question right now selected from the chat? Excellent. No, and I think, I don't know if we start with John, and then I'll go to the rest of the panelists also to reflect on that.
Maybe
but John or
Juliet,
Juliet, please.
Yeah, this is exactly, it's exactly the question, why sometimes and why not other times? And what is it about the shifts in the socioeconomic landscape that creates opportunities or not? So I think and it really brings us back to the heart of that framework. The reason that we wanted to develop this framework was to enable us to, as a sector, to have a conversation about learning. Learning's so kind of fluffy and amorphous, and it's also a dumping ground for everything, that it was quite difficult to know really what we were talking about. I think what's really interesting One is it's quite easy to be pessimistic about learning, but the functional inertia is in some ways a positive thing in that it is functioning. It is functioning, and by looking back through the lessons over the years and the State of the Humanitarian System report, we can also see significant progress over the years. We've done an exercise looking back over ALNAP's lessons papers over 20 years, and it's a good reminder of how far we have come, both in shifts in language and shifts in technical interventions and the overall effectiveness of a lot of what we're doing, which is very positive. But the inertia bit is, is really bothers the sector. And I think what the COVID example really demonstrated was that difference between the niche and the socio-technical regime. During the COVID pandemic, it was clear there was the learning and adaptation at a country level was fizzing. It was fizzing and bubbling, and like we had an ALNAP meeting last October, bringing together examples of all the changes in adaptation and learning that was happening, of which there was stacks, absolutely stacks. What we failed to do was to cohere those into anything that could actually influence the change in that middle bracket. And what we see is that, so we see that the niche innovations, whether formal or informal, are happening all the time. And there's also these, the pressures from the socio-technical landscape are also coming all the time. COVID was one, Ukraine is another. The inert bit is the institutional permafrost in the middle, which is us. You know, we are the inert bit. There's something about the cultures and the institutions that we have set up that are resistant to the changing influences from both top and bottom, and I think that's really interesting to ask ourselves why and how much can we change. It's a little incongruous, I think, of us sometimes to compare the learning process of cash to the learning process of localization or participation, because they are fundamentally different, very, very different things, and they're not very comparable in lots of ways, because cash aligned with the institutional incentives of that middle ground. And so after a while, once you'd got the evidence, once the opportunities had come along, the institutional, the institutions in the middle welcomed it once they'd got over a few teething issues, and then it accelerated. Localization and participation don't align as easily. They come at a cost to the organization. They are slower. They require a disempowerment in some ways of the institutions in the middle. They're harder to evidence in a satisfactory way that pleases the donors. They're harder to sell to our private fundraisers. So they're much harder, and they're not really the same in lots of ways. But I think then the question comes to that, the challenges to that, the institutions in the middle, when there's an opportunity, and of course it's difficult to talk about crises as an opportunity, but they are an opportunity for learning and change. The question is now, what do those institutions need to look at now in order to change? Because you're right, the COVID niche learning never coalesced into a more significant change, and we've really gone back to the status quo in most ways. And I think the onus is really on the sector to say, okay, how do we navigate this process to make sure that this window of opportunity created by a crisis like Ukraine, which only comes around every few years, luckily, how do we actually capitalize that?
Would you have any concrete suggestions how we could, enable that, that we move from that niche up to the permafrost?
I think it's difficult, but I think having a framework to talk about it definitely helps. I think there's two things that, in particular. One is when we looked back at the lessons that had progressed and the lessons that hadn't. It was the ones that had were the technical ones around cash or wash or those things, because we assume they're largely within the ability of individual agencies to address. So they can change their standard operating procedures, they can change their technical approaches, and then change happens. The ones that weren't moving, so the accountability to affected populations, localization, linking relief and development, they require collective action. So no individual can tackle them alone. So the question with Ukraine isn't what's any individual agency going to do differently, it's what the sector is going to do collectively differently in this response to this crisis. I think that's one. The other reason that they hadn't progressed, we feel, was because they require a fundamental power shift within the sector. And the problem is that we're not institutionally incentivized to make that power shift. And I think one of the interesting things to look at is, are there ways that we can use technical interventions to start to create those power shifts more purposefully? If we know we can't shift that triangle, it's a big old task, but are there ways that we can use every single one of our technical interventions where we know we can make progress to chip away at those power shifts that needs to happen?
Thank you. I think I saw Eric, you wanted to contribute and comment
Well, I
this or
think
something
Juliet
else.
said so many substantial things, but I completely agree that it's an issue of power involved, and I think it's been played out also in the Ukraine response among different ACT members. We have seen some European members saying that now the national and the local organizations and the local communities that we're working with inside Ukraine should perhaps be more like subcontractors to this individual European member. So this is a conversation we're having, and then we say, no, that is not the modus operandi, and that's not according to the strategy and the policy that we have adopted for the ACT Alliance. We have to stick to this. So it's more about capacity sharing going together. But I think we have to remember that it's about sort of critically critical self-examination. What's your organization, the organizational rationale? I mean, if you look ahead 2030, 2040, surely you will say, we will not have an unchanged humanitarian architecture. Something has to happen. And then you have to ask questions about your own organization. Why do we exist? We lost the strategic partnership with SIDA 2 years ago, and that was painful. And I was very public in the debate as well. But I think it was good because we had to make a major rethink in terms of the added value of ACT Charter Sweden. What does it mean to work together in the ACT Alliance? And in terms of this power shift that is necessary, what can we do together as the Alliance? And I think there is something good coming out of that process. But it means questioning also sort of your organizational journey. So we have said now in the revised strategic plan for ACT Charter Sweden in 2030, a substantial amount of the institutional funds that we have today from back donors will be received directly from local partners. And meanwhile, we partner with them in sharing capacities. And I think that's rather brave to say that, because most of the organizations will preserve their brands and believe that we will have sort of our mandates and our role also in 2030 and 2040. But then we will stay with a resource allocation where 93% of the funds will still go to international NGOs or to global CSOs in the north, and only 7% directly to local partners in the south. So this is really a big power issue.
Per, Linda, any reflections from you on the question put in the chat, continue on some of the other
No, I think the
comments
point
made.
Juliet made about the using technical shifts to leverage institutional is really interesting. And I think it's interesting thinking about, the kind of things we evaluate, and when we do medical interventions, and do we evaluate the quality of the interventions, or do we evaluate the organization and the organizational strategy behind that? And the organization is often more apt to listen to the things related to the specifics of the technical intervention, but the points about, the strategy behind it and the organizational attitude is more interesting. It just requires a different type of space for that conversation.
Yes, let's see. Yeah, now you can hear me. Apropos the elephant, I come from sort of the policy side of things, and I tend to look at the elephant from that perspective. And much of what has been said as response to this question, I just want to subscribe to. I think it is about power. I think it's about control. I think it's about fight for funding. But it's also about new public management. It's about risk aversion. It's about an obsession of control. And this is a disease in modern society. And as you can read in many fikarum in Sweden, din morsa jobbar inte här. Which means if you want to see change, if you want to have something done, you have to just do it yourself, right? So my credo again, one has to question the way that we work now. It's mechanized, and it fuels power struggle and control rather than partnership and cooperation. Thank you.
I'm a bit curious. Do you have any even more concrete proposal? I mean, coming from the sitting of being a major humanitarian donor, as we as donors, what would that entail in terms of that we should change from within?
The tragic part of this is that SIDA as a government agency work in frameworks and strategies and legal frameworks even that in a way now modern culture does not really allow you as bureaucrats and civil servants to question that. We just dance along. And the piper is playing, and we say, well, yeah, we have to, adhere to these rules and regulations, and we have to, fill in all these different blankets and whatnot. My point is that true change comes from civil society and comes from strength in people with strong opinions. So I think those of us who are SIDA or Foreign Office or so, civil servants, we should not back down from our role as civil servants of being critical to the system we work in. And those of you who work in civil society, you should put pressure on us, really. And this is, public debate and questioning what is really going on here. Because it is about power and it is about politics. And what led to the lack of success in Istanbul, I would say, without going into too much details, was actually a strong political intervention from a handful of extremely strong international actors. Some agencies and some state actors saying just enough, we will not lose control over this, we will gain even more control. We're not talking about partnership, we're talking about subcontracting, and we're talking about control. And then, as I also said in my previous statement, the fundamental input to our process was about lack of funding, as if the problem was only the lack of dollars. Not partnership, but money. So it was a bit, but could we solve this with privatization? Could one, have a private enterprise? Could we privatize this as we have privatized the welfare sector in Sweden and the UK? Yeah, maybe. So it's politics. And we find ourselves in an environment that is completely politicized. Is it okay? I don't think so. I try to be critical, although I'm an old civil servant, so why don't you try?
Thank you for that source of inspiration. Erik, you were
since you asked the question, Lisa, whether we can also be very concrete, I think in terms of what both Juliet and John talked about, to have sort of some almost technical, practical experiences of localization that you have to compile in reports and make them accessible to policymakers. We've done that. I think we're still a niche network in local to global, which has been promoted by Christian Aid, Church Aid and Act Church of Sweden. But I think now we have gathered very concrete experiences from 9 different humanitarian contexts. And use it sort of as an advocacy tool towards the policymakers. And then we have been successful with ECHO, for instance, that have responded to this and saying that absolutely surviving community-led crisis response sounds logical and we would like to support that. And also they've changed their financial modalities, making it possible to have group cash grants or community grants to deliver that. So piecemeal changes we see all the time. And I think, as you said, your stages of change, I think that's good to look at it from that angle, that it will not happen in the next 2, 3 or 4 years, but it's chipping into the system and then suddenly it become part of the mainstream. So, and we will never know when that will happen, but we will continue to push.
Thanks for that concrete example. And I also seen 2 hands in the audience here. And I first saw Lennart, and then I'll ask you to introduce yourself if we take you as a second comment. Yes.
Okay,
Hey,
I'm
Lennart.
Lennart Wolgemuth. I'm a guest professor in Gothenburg University on aid issues. I hesitate to bring up, but I agree fully with Per that presenting what are the obstacles today. What I want to underline, there is no lack of knowledge what should be done. When I was head of a humanitarian assistance at SIDA in the end of 80s, we have had a similar discussion, and we asked Mary B. Anderson, who was then very well known because of her writings, to describe to us what we should do in order to meet all these aspects that you have mentioned here. And she did a fantastic study, and I really hope that you can find that study. I think she looked at 80 countries in the world, where she looked at what were the problems and tried to find successful success stories when it comes to localization and practical work in different ways. And I mean, what I just want to underline is the issue is eternal. The problems are eternal, and it's not lack of knowledge that we are continue as we do. It's institutional issues and Per summarized them very well. Thank you.
Thank you, Lennart. So that was more a comment. But let's see if anybody would like to perhaps comment on that comment. But we take another question here in the audience in interest of time.
Okay. Hello, my name is Anneli Eriksson, and I work at the Karolinska Institute at the Department for Global Health on health and disasters there. But I also have a long past with MSF, so I'm biased in that sense. No, I wanted, and I assume that it hasn't, I mean, as we say, some things hasn't changed, maybe not so much has changed since my last reflection on this, which is more on, maybe on practical aspects then, but then I think sometimes when we talk about learning, in order to learn, you need to ask the right questions. You need to ask open questions, and you need to be open for the answers. And I think the humanitarian system is really lacking that openness. A lot of the questions we ask, a lot of the sort of evidence we are trying to gather, it's to be used in advocacy in order to get more funding. And as a donor, you're not really interested in learning about organizations' failures, because if you learn about them, you will not give them more money, right? And so any organization is very keen to present successes, but not so much interested in anything else. And if you don't, I mean, if we don't share our mistakes, we're not going to move further, because that's also really part of how to improve. And I think it's a disgrace, really, and we're basically not learning, we're making mistakes, we're not sharing them with others, meaning that other organizations will continue to make similar mistakes. And I was part of a scoping study together with Evidence Aid some years ago, where we were looking at, to what extent are we actually basing our actions in the humanitarian fields, in the different sectors, on evidence? Do we know what we're doing? And the gap map that we came up with was somehow outrageous in terms of what we don't know, what we are doing without really, I mean, what do we actually know about what works when we talk about the field of early recovery? I mean, there's so many things that we're not sure about it, but we do it and we continue to do it, and we're not really ready to share what doesn't work. And I think, yes, I'm on your side, Per, but even when it comes to action, there's also a lot of things that we don't know and that we need to be open enough to learn from one another. So not a question, but more of a statement.
I think I'll let in Gun, and then I hand over for reflections and comments to the panel.
Thank you. I'm Gun Eriksson Skog from SIDA. I've worked with development cooperation and watched humanitarian support. It's very interesting to hear these lessons here. I think they are far more general than applying to humanitarian assistance. They say a lot. I mean, I recognize everything from development cooperation. And from learning process generally, particularly within organizations. So we see this within SIDA in various ways, and I have so many thoughts that sort of come out of this. It's not easy to say what brings change about, but I think crisis, and you, Eric, you got a crisis when you didn't get funding. And why is funding important? Because it not only creates conditions, it shapes incentives. And I think we far too often forget, we talk about power, that's fine, but it's incentives that drive a lot of what we do, and we don't analyze that enough. There is change going on, and I liked what you said about systemic approaches, and we are actually increasingly using systemic approaches within SIDA in development cooperation. It takes time, but it's ongoing, and I have seen sort of one such process of making markets work for the poor, the market systems development approach, which is an example where a lot of work was done by individuals driving change at micro level and in the field. And at a certain point, a process became ripe, and that was an evaluation of how SIDA was working with this. And then it was also the context was somehow ripe, and then it got traction, but that could not be planned. So I mean, you have to constantly work for change, and sometimes the situation is right, and then you have to grab the initiative. But that also takes committed people who really are willing to do the job. As to humanitarian assistance, I think it's very interesting to hear. The cash example is excellent. The next step may maybe be to use support and use markets and recognize the role of private sector, not as in terms of privatizing humanitarian assistance, but using and supporting local actors also in the private sector, not only civil society. I stop there.
Thank you, Gun. Yes, please.
As organizers, since we started late, we can add a few minutes.
5 past.
Five past. If that is all right with everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Mats. I think a lot of interesting comments there, and Lennart, I think Mary B. Anderson's work is really living. I mean, see that the fact that we have the conflict perspective as part of our instruction these days is that you always need to think about, I mean, the do no harm methodology that she established and all that. So I think her legacy is well established within SIDA, and so that was more of a comment, but we always need to be reminded that I mean there are a lot of work and a lot of brilliant ideas that are there on in various reports. But I think there were some interesting reflections and comments from many colleagues, and I hand over primarily to John and Juliet to pick up on some of these questions and comments.
So many interesting questions.
Yes.
Where to start? I mean, very, very quickly, I'll just say a tiny few words about some of them. I mean, Leonard, we know Mary Anderson's work very well. We helped launch her book, and I would completely agree with you. It's full of incredible examples about what's happening at the local level. And so I completely agree that there's a lot of information out there. The way that it brings about change, though, is the big question. And, you know, as Juliet was saying earlier, when this socio-technical regime is not receptive to listening and hearing and discussing this kind of information, it doesn't go anywhere. And so, you know, I have a tremendous amount of respect for Mary Anderson's work. I hope that work gets used more and more as we go forward. So Annaliese's thing about learning and being open to learning. I think I completely agree again with what you're saying there. There's a lack of evidence and there's a certain resistance to learning and being open to learning. But what I have seen over the years in the humanitarian world is more openness, actually. I'm sure I have detected this. You can see this in the way that organizations are much more open to putting independent evaluation reports in the public domain. I know that when I first started, it was very, very difficult to get organisations to do this, and UNHCR, believe it or not, were one of the first organisations to do this. And I think what we've found over the years is that when independent evaluations, warts and all evaluations, are put in the public domain, actually they have an enhancing effect on the reputation of the agency. And it's quite contrary to the fact to some people's idea that you've got to cover everything up in case people find out what's going on. I don't think it's actually like that. When you're open, people are much more likely to say, well, you know, they've looked at their dirty washing, here it is, they're going to improve. I think the problem comes when agencies appear to be hiding things. That's when you get problems, and that's when you get journalists sniffing around and that kind of thing. So I think there has been, I agree with you, but I think I have seen a slight improvement over the years. You know, the idea of markets and cash, completely agree with you there. And I think one of the really interesting things about the cash experience in the humanitarian sector is that when this new breakthrough learning began to happen, one of the things that happened there was lots of people coalesced around this and created a fantastic network, the CALP network, the Cash Learning, whatever a CALP stands for anyway. Yeah, Cash Active Learning and Programming Network. But you can see when something like that is set up, you can get much more bang for your buck, because lots of they're actually keeping their eye on it as you go forward and taking on board new ideas, monitoring what works and what doesn't work. And I'm sure that your ideas of using markets more will come as a direct consequence of that kind of learning. Well, there you go. Yeah, 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 yeah. But it's just underscores the importance of networks, and when these things do happen, you know, you can build. I mean, like the ALNAP network on learning. I think just the other thing. Can I say one more thing? Okay, it's just to reflect on everything that people have said here, most of which I think very insightful. I very much agree with it. Thinking about our model. You know, you asked the question about concrete steps. You know, it's always the question, what do we do? And I think two of these three levels, we can take concrete steps. And so at the niche level, I think these things have to be promoted. The innovations and the research has to keep being promoted, advocated for, funded and encouraged. Got to keep all that bubbling along. And I think Eric described it beautifully. In terms of what happens at the level of regime, where he said that, you know, that how did you put it? Critical self-examination of each organisation. I mean, that really, we're not going to go forward unless each individual organisation does it in the way that you are doing it in ACT. I think that's terribly important. And having this framework perhaps helps that discussion. We hope it does, because it provides that systemic view, which I think is very helpful. At the landscape level is more tricky, isn't it? Because we're in the lap of whoever asked right at the beginning. The first question: what kind of emergency is going to help us? Well, I don't know, because it all depends what kind of learning we have in place and what stage the regime are at in changing their ideas. But whatever happens at that level, I do hope that it creates a more conducive environment. But at the niche level and the socio-technical regime, there are concrete steps that we can take which will help create the probability and the possibility that real change is going to happen when an emergency happens.
Thank you for these quite concrete suggestions and how we could take forward. And I'm looking at Mats. I guess we should start closing down. Another two. Can I just, I'm looking around and just to see any more, I mean, just the final, say, the concrete next steps, Linda, from your side.
I was thinking about, I mean, and we talked about it during lunch, and then I heard it in the room as well, this idea that, like, you know, a lot of things have been tried and a lot has been learned and there's a lot of knowledge out there and all of this. So then I think it's about two things. It's about continuing to contextualize that learning and to find the ways in which you can wedge things into a system wherever you need. and then to look at the learning in like in different ways, you know, to turn it upside down and to think about it differently. And I think, you know, you're all speaking about much more like macro questions, but as a little person in the room, you know, the little, I mean, what you need are like units like ours, the people in our unit, our supporters outside in our organization who will actually do something with what we produce and who will look for ways to like, you know, leverage it at times when it can be useful and that it can bring something about. So even old learning is good learning.
Good. Per, I mean, you had a very strong credo, and I mean, your messaging was quite clear. Do you want to?
I have
just
one. I have
another one,
idea.
probably.
It's now 4 years until its 10 years anniversary of this useless humanitarian summit. So why don't we call for a real World Humanitarian Summit and build from beneath? That's 4 years. Make it happen and don't let the big boys hijack the show.
Thank you. Very concrete. And Erik?
But still we can hold them accountable to the commitments that they made at the World Humanitarian Summit, so we should not just
Not to waste it. No?
forget about that. Yeah. No, but just to say as well, I think change will also come at the landscape level, as you referred to, John. I think we should not underestimate the power of sort of the emergence of strong, resourceful organization in the global south that will challenge this system as well. So I think it will eat into the system. And as you said, Gunnar Eriksson Skog, it goes far beyond sort of the humanitarian sector. We have had a number of seminars, time to decolonize aid. What does it mean in practice? But I think these are issues that are coming up when I'm sitting there as the chairperson of the Global Act Alliance. I mean, you have it within the alliance and you will have it in the sector as well. These are crucial issues to discuss.
Thank you very much. And just from my side, when I was reading to prepare this, I think it's really as a major humanitarian donor to be encouraged in innovation and see what's happening on that niche innovation and not getting stuck in the permafrost cluster and try to challenge ourselves and be self-critical and challenge various established systems. I think that's really one takeaway that I look forward to taking forward with the humanitarian team here at SIDA. So I think for me it's been really helpful to have a bit of that kind of map to navigate accordingly, and we look forward to continue this conversation. It was not enough time for a very complex topic, but I think it was extremely useful and we learned a lot from colleagues from ALNAP. Thanks again for sharing all your insights, and I look forward to continue this conversation. And I do think that in the humanitarian sector it is possible to combine action with reflection and learning. I think sometimes it's seen as a trade-off, and I really think that's something that we also should strive towards, to see that it's a necessity to combine these two and not to see them as a trade-off. So I think with that I close this seminar. Thanks to the panelists, excellent contributions, and again thanks to ALNAP, and thanks for excellent questions and comments from the audience. Thank you.